that if you give me a notion of intergenerational well-being, whether it's based, irrespective of the philosophical underpinnings of the notion, whether it's based on utilitarianism, whether it's based on Buddhist philosophy, it doesn't really matter. No matter what the conception of intergenerational well-being is, there is a corresponding value to every capital asset the economy has inherited from the past, such that if you were to measure the aggregate value of the assets of the economy using those weights, then intergenerational well-being increases over time if and only if this aggregate index, the weighted sum of the capital assets, increases. It's an if and only if statement, so it's devoid of any empirical content. It simply says, and it's an extremely important simply says, that instead of looking for the movement of intergenerational well-being, study instead the movements in wealth. Of course, the thing that connects these objects, these assets, to intergenerational well-being are the weights, the prices, the shadow prices. And so the trick is going to be the real hard work, in fact, the main work, after you've got some estimates of the assets, would be to estimate these shadow prices. That's where the philosophical, the ethical basis of intergenerational well-being will reveal itself. And we'll come back to that. There's no escaping it, that's the point. We can't fight this issue. Ethics are moral values, a society's values about what constitutes a reasonable or a desirable social infrastructure that cannot be avoided by the accountant. The accountant that has emerged out of it, so to speak. Now that might seem a bad news, but it's inevitable news. You might think that in some cases perhaps market prices would be good approximations to the shadow prices. To the extent that is, thank God, somehow the market has solved these ethical issues and has transmitted those in the form of information which we can now use. And of course, national accounts have been based on that presumption to date. If a national accountant such as James Mead or Dick Stone were asked, well, where is your ethics? They would say, well, we're making an approximation here, that the market is working reasonably well to aggregate these values that people have about their children's worth and their grandchildren's worth and so forth. In a mysterious kind of a way, their actions are transmitting that information to prices. They were not devoid of ethical sensitivity. People like these great people like Simon Kuznets or the founders of national accounts. But that would have been their justification. In an imperfect world, you rely on imperfect signals. But at least you know why they're imperfect, which is what you really want, are shadow prices. Kriya has warned us that the problems magnify when it comes to natural capital, and something I'll come back to in a minute. So that was a basic theorem. I'm going to avoid talking about population here for the reason that one can also prove, and that's not as general a theorem as the one I've already mentioned, that if population increases, then you could, under a reasonably plausible set of circumstances, replace wealth by wealth per capita. And ask whether wealth per capita, corrected for the distribution of wealth, is increasing or declining, for judging the sustainability of the program that you're following. But we can come back to population. And one of the things I want to do in this lecture is to point out a number of things that perhaps have occurred to you already, but you have, as good citizens and good researchers, put them aside. And I want to bring them out because in my own work I found them to be of significant empirical importance. haven't said very much about policy. Remember, I talked about two types of perturbations. One, which results in our notion of sustainable development, and the other, which is to do with policy analysis. Is there a connection? And I suggested that they were essentially the same. And let me just take you to tour for about 2 minutes to show why they're the same. The criterion for judging the desirability of an investment project, the standard investment project, which I said arrives at your desk and your boss has told you, asked you to write a report suggesting as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. What do? You have the feasibility report and large literature dating back to the early 70s, some stemming from the United Nations, suggested that what we should be doing is to estimate the present discounted value of the flow of social profits generated by the project. Social profits is extremely important here. Social means that you're using shadow prices as opposed to necessarily market prices. Well, what's that got to do with wealth? Well, it turns out it's very easy to prove that the present discounted value of the flow of social profits of a project, remember, it's a present discounted value, which means what? It means that it's a stock. You're adding up flows. The profits are flows, but when you add them up, that's a stock, because you're adding up the whole lot of the future and collapsing them today. So it's a stock. And the present discounted value of the project is the stock, the change in something called the stock that will take place if we accept the project. The question is, what is that object whose change is being measured by the PDD? And the answer is wealth. So, wealth again appears, although we don't usually use the word wealth when we talk about present discounted value or profits of a project, but essentially what it's measuring is the change in the wealth into the economy that's brought about, or that would be brought about if the project were accepted. Hence, if the PDD is negative and you recommend that it should not be accepted, it's because if you undertake it, wealth will have declined. And if it's positive, you say yes, that's because wealth will have increased. So wealth seems to be the organizing principle in welfare economics, in intertemporal and intergenerational welfare economics, whether you do policy analysis or whether you do sustainability analysis. It's the basis on which these national statistics need to conform. Now, it's all well and good to talk about wealth as being a weighted sum of the various multitude of assets the economy has inherited from the past. The question arises, what does an asset mean? How do I recognize an asset when I see it? Notice, of course, that talking in terms of assets means we are, in a sense, I'm emphasizing that part of national accounts which deal with stocks, not with flows. Although change in the wealth is a flow. So it's not as though the flows will be ever absent, and I'll be coming back to that in a minute. For the moment, I want to concentrate on the notion of assets themselves, because the flows they generate can only be identified after you know what those things that generate the flows are. Okay. Now, traditionally, an asset was regarded as being, a capital asset was regarded as being any durable good, like land or machines or buildings, which satisfied three properties. One, it should be an input in production. Two, it is an object which produces a flow of future consumption, whose present value can be marketed. It's a very market-oriented notion, the traditional notion of an asset. For good reason. Economics was being developed in Anglo-Saxon countries, in England, certainly in the early 20th century. And third, it can be alienated. Again, it's a market notion. That is, it can be captured by one person for his exclusive control. That's what I mean by alienation. Of course, that rules out public goods. That's one of the main problems. We'll come back to this issue in a minute. So there are these three notions which seem to have defined an asset. I'm actually borrowing these from a conversation I recently had with Professor Kenneth Arrow, who seems to know everything. And I once asked him, what did you, when you were young, think of when you thought about an asset? And these were what he told me. But, of course, the way I'm thinking of asset, I'm thinking of goods which are implied by welfare economics. Not something that I impose on the analysis that I want to undertake. So I'm not going to presume that we're in a market economy. I'm not going to certainly not presume that we're working in an economy where the markets are working very well, aggregating all the ethical beliefs in the right way. That would be just an incredible distortion. We want a theory which is sufficiently flexible that it can, in principle, be used no matter where you happen to be, no matter how outrageously bad the government is, or how terrible governance happens to be. You can still imagine, in even the worst kind of governance structure, the worst kind of atrocious government, you can still imagine an honest civil servant sitting there and doing the best he can. What language do we give him or her? That's what we're discussing here. Okay? Stated formally, by an asset I mean any state variable. This is the only bit of mathematics I'll do. One expression. State variable of the socio-ecological processes that are driving the economy. They will, of course, include the usual, all things like buildings, machines, and so forth. Land. It will include now, it will have to include, if you write down a model, a dynamic model of an economy, it will have to include human capital. Capital. Education, which we regard as capital these days, by the way. But notice they violate at least one of the three conditions that are arrogated. Health cannot be marketed. You can't sell your health to somebody else. You can certainly sell the productivity of your health, that's for sure, but not the object itself. Well, that's not quite true. Transplants, I suppose, our exception. But the exception suggests why you're already breaking these, at least some of the conditions. But health and education certainly seem to be the kinds of assets that are important. In fact, some studies these days suggest, at least were suggesting, that they're the most important. Education in particular, human capital in the United States is regarded as being really education, not health. Health seems to be somewhat else in the human capital literature. But human capital dominates physical capital, at least in the estimates of people like Bill Nordhaus, Bill Jorgensen, and others. The ones I've seen, far and away dominates. So if you were to think of the wealth of the United States, and somebody says, well, which bite of wealth really is out there, they will be saying education, 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 because it dominates all the buildings and the roads and the machines and so forth and so on. But even education embeds in it what? Embodied knowledge, skills. The stuff that is in our brains and our muscle part. What about public knowledge? The differential calculus, integral calculus, laws of thermodynamics. They're out there now, and anybody can plug it provided he has got the skills, he's got the human capital, she has got the human capital. But those are capital assets too. In fact, we talk about that knowledge capital. Then what about cultural capital, religious capital, institutional capital? Notice how the notion of capital has been usurped by pretty much